Today we're going to talk about the classroom application of Google Forms and Google Sheets. So Google Forms, the easiest thing to use it for is a quiz in your classroom or as some kind of assessment task basically. So setting up those questions, setting a mark allocation to it, setting up the correct answers there. You can even put in your feedback for them throughout that and have your students just complete a quiz in your class. Now you can use that obviously as an assessment for learning. At the beginning, you might diagnose what they already know and how you're going to link what they're about to learn to what they already know. You might want to just check halfway through a lesson, one of those pivot point type formative assessments where you're just like, okay, I just needed to have a quick check of who knows this. So you might get them to all answer 2 questions or something in a Google form that quickly tells you whether or not they've learned what you're trying to teach them at the beginning of that lesson before you move on to something else, or maybe you need to reteach it if they all get it wrong. You can also use Google Forms to survey your classes. One of the things that I like to use it for quite a lot. This is not a quiz, but this is more to get information from your students. So you might use this at the beginning of the year just to find out what your students' interests are and all those types of things. But you could also use this just as you're evaluating your units, or if you want to evaluate a lesson in particular. And I would encourage you, even the lesson that you use Google Forms in or that you use your Google Sheets in, use a form at the end of the lesson as well to collect data to see how that actually has helped you with your students' learning. Just get them to give you some feedback that way. So you can really get a lot better data for what you then do as you reflect on your programs and your units and your lessons to improve them for next time. And it's not just a teacher's perspective, it's also the student's perspective that's being taken into account there. You can also use it to collect students' work. So when you create a question where they can attach or to upload a file or paste a link to a file that's in Google Drive or something, that then gets put into a spreadsheet, really easy to track that way to see what students are getting done, particularly if you don't use Google Classroom or something like that. This type of use for Google Forms is fantastic. You can also use Google Forms to build your own adventures, just using that go to section based on answer type thing to then allow either your students can build the adventure where they're telling the story or whatever they're doing and then they go somewhere else. I often use the go to different sections too for doing review stuff, and so there's actually a link on this page to a Google form that I use for revision for HSC, PTHPE, sports medicine, where the students basically, you can't finish the form without getting every question right. So if they get the question wrong, the next section is then a video that explains to them what they got wrong, or it's a video that's got the content in it that they got wrong, and then they can go back to the question and they have to get it right, and then they'll skip the video and go to the next questions. You can also use Google Forms and Google Sheets to measure student progress. Now, this could be just by doing lots and lots of Google quizzes, for example. You might test them with a whole bunch of multiple choice and you can track how they're progressing with their knowledge and understanding in that way. Obviously, it's not going to be the best for application unless you start to put in longer extended response stuff, and then you're going to be allocating some kind of tracking system to that, whether it's ABC or whether you're giving them marks out of 5 or something. But that's really for you for tracking. I don't recommend that you're giving students marks all the time. I don't think that's very helpful for them at all. It's also really good for providing feedback. You can, for example, stick your marking rubric or the success criteria for when students know that they've learnt something into a Google form, and then each week you might reflect on it and go, okay, this student's progressed from here to there, and just have a sliding scale system, and then you can see how they're progressing. You can even get the students to do that in terms of a self-reflection type activity. If you're giving them the success criteria as a Google form and have them just self-rate themselves against that criteria, where are they up to? Are they a 5 out of 5, or are they maybe still struggling at the 2 level? And that gives you a bit of an idea of their confidence in what they're learning as well. Students can use it as well to collect data if they're creating their own forms, if they're doing their own kind of research. They can go and survey people and collect all that data in a Google form, or they can use it even just to monitor their own data in terms of entering their own marks and all that kind of stuff. Now, obviously, Google Forms connects to Sheets, and so that really allows for greater tracking. It allows things to be really visual when you're looking at the data. I have used Google Forms before as marking rubrics, so I might be watching my students do some kind of practical activity and I'll use the Google form, select the student's name, and then go through and mark or give them a mark allocation based on the criteria that's in that Google form that helps me to understand how they're going. You can also use forms and sheets to monitor the data that the students provide for you to help you to then evaluate your programs and units more effectively. So you might have a look at your diagnostic assessments and your summative assessments and your formative assessments throughout, and just see how much learning your students have actually done throughout that unit, whether they've really grasped all the content there, what might need to be updated next time when you're teaching it, those types of things. And you also want to make sure that hopefully you're using any data that you have as you go as well, so that you're actually benefiting the students in front of you, not just improving your teaching for the next lot of students who come through. Now, I do want you to remember privacy of information when it comes to data. So if you're collecting all this survey data and you're getting all this information from your students or from elsewhere, just make sure that you are using your school account, that you're storing it really tightly in Google Drive so that only people inside your school can access it, or only you can access it and the people you share it with, and then don't share it outside of your school unless, of course, it is deemed by government or law or something that you need to. And then obviously you can, but generally try not to share this data that you've got, particularly if you decide, for example, to use Sheets as your mark book or to use it as your attendance records. You then need to make sure you're storing that for legal purposes, as people then might come back to need to check whether or not the student was at school that day or something in 5 years. So you need to make sure it's actually stored properly in Google Drive according to your school's systems and policies. So just make sure that you're being really careful with students' data, and it could even be other staff's data. If you're surveying your staff using the Google Forms, that might also be something you do.